40s,
because of the major world events
the social changes,
and the impact on the decades to come.
The 40s is important because of the major impacts of World War II,
the setup of the Cold War, and the establishment of present conflicts.
Economic failure in Germany in the 20s made many citizens angry and upset. The people wanted someone to blame for their failures. Hitler proposed the racially inferior, like the Jews. Hitler believed in ridding Germany of the Jews, and the way he would do this is concentration camps. In April of 1940, Auschwitz opened. The camp had 3 goals: to hold the enemies of the Nazis, to use prisoners as slave labor, and to kill the racially inferior. The first prisoners at Auschwitz were German criminals and Polish political prisoners. Then the Jews were brought in. They worked in nearby armaments factories.
Get back to work, you filthy Jews! Come on!
The Jews were worked to death, starved, and got infected with many diseases from unsanitary conditions. The worst was the gas chambers. Every day, Jews were killed in fake showers in Germany's attempt of ethnic cleansing. Roughly 1.3 million people were deported to Auschwitz and 1.1 million people died. This genocide scared everyone and would end up shaping the politics of the modern world. All nations would come together to prevent another genocide of this scale, still affecting us today in the terms of the UN.
I was born in 1889 in Austria-Hungary. I am the 4th of 6 children, and I was only 3 years old when we moved from Austria to Germany. My father and I always clashed about my appreciation for artwork. It has always been fascinating to me. Every piece has its own story. My father constantly being disappointed led to my detachment from my family. When I was young, I always wanted to be looked up to as a real artist. Being rejected twice from the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna killed the dream. The filthy Jews who ran the gallery wouldn't buy my art. Who wouldn't want this?
Coming in second in both elections against Hindenburg forced him to elect me Chancellor of Germany, with my Nazi party controlling most of Reichstag. I was one of the most powerful men in Germany. A fire then consumed the Reichstag building, and I quickly blamed the communists and the Jews, and my Nazi-controlled Reichstag passed the Enabling Act. This gave me many powers to deal with the Jews and the communists. Then after President Hindenburg died in 1934, I merged the offices of President and Chancellor. Accomplishment was my economics policy that helped Germany out of the Great Depression. I inspired projects like the Autobahn, and I gave people jobs through the military.
Sieg Heil.
But at the same time, over 11 million people were killed in a genocide over ethnic cleansing. Over 6 million of those people were Jews. I engaged in World War II, which costed billions and forced a split in Germany post-war.
The Americans have ruined our economy and prevented us from expanding, so we need to strike first and weaken them.
Economic sanctions imposed on Japan by the U.S. stopped oil and other vital resources from reaching the Japanese. In order to get these resources to feed their war machine, the Japanese had their sight on the South Pacific region. This included the U.S.-held Philippines and British territories. Attacking these lands would mean provoking the U.S. and Britain. These industrial powerhouses have built up massive navies in the Pacific. These could rival the Japanese Navy. Before they provoked the U.S., the Japanese decided to soften the U.S. Navy. A Japanese naval task commanded by Yamato attacked the naval base of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On Sunday, December 7th, 360 planes damaged the USS Arizona and USS Utah, along with most of the Pacific Fleet. This crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. This attack had no warning and killed 2,300 soldiers. That Monday, FDR issued a speech and Congress declared war on Japan. This attack would pull the U.S. into the war, relieving the beaten Britain. Up to this point in the war, the British have been pushed out of Europe and onto their land. By drawing the U.S. into the war, Japan would change the tide of the war to the Allies because the full industrial and military might of the U.S. would be behind them, making this a significant event in the 40s.
Welcome.
What was your early life like?
I was born January 30th, 1882 in New York. I grew up wealthy and attended a boarding school. Then I went to Harvard and left to Columbia Law School.
How did you get into politics?
I entered politics winning a New York State Senate seat as a Democrat in a district that voted Republican for 32 years, and I won in a landslide. And then I was nominated for vice president under James S. Cox, but we lost in 1920 to Warren G. Harding because some people thought they were doing good. Collected quite a bit of stamps in my time, and an impressive collection.
How did you become president?
Well, my time came to shine when the 1929 stock market crash came down and they blamed the Republicans. I stole 42 states from the Republicans, beating Herbert Hoover in 32. I also won in 36 and 40 and 44. You know, what I'd give to be sailing right now. You guys aren't quite that interesting.
What's your greatest accomplishment?
Well, I would think my greatest accomplishment would be fixing the Great Depression. I inherited it, and I did quite a bit to fix it. I helped revitalize and give people more money so they could help fix our economy through Bubble Up. I passed acts like the FERA, the CCC, the AAA, the NIRA, and the TVA. There was many more, but we can forget about those. I also expanded our army in preparation for World War II, and I also gave the Allies the fire hose to put out the fire that is Germany.
What's your biggest failure?
Well, you know, if we were counting, I'd say I did way more good than bad. But some people say that some of my programs, like the TVA and the HOLC, are too socialist because it brought the U.S. into competition with the private companies. That's fine though. Also, some people say I exploited the national debt, but $50 billion is a price to pay for rebuilding the economy. Also, the debt got to $258 billion. Well, that was the war, so it won't be.
After France fell early in the war, the Axis held all of Europe and left the Allies with no foothold. This posed a problem for the Allies because they had no direct way to invade Germany and end the war. The Allies had to come up with a plan to invade Europe. They decided they would need to invade somewhere in northern France across the English Channel. The Allies picked Normandy, France to invade. The invasion wouldn't be easy because of German forts and defense structures on the French coast called the Atlantic Wall. The day came and thousands of Americans, Canadians, and British troops attacked Normandy beaches. They were supported by American and British navies and air forces. After much fighting, the Allies established a beachhead in Europe. This would spell the closing of the war that devastated Europe. Because the Allies had a direct route to free Europe and invade Germany, D-Day marks the final days of the war and is major in the 40s because its success brought the end of the war.
I'm really missing Johnny. He's been in the Pacific for almost a year and a half.
Yeah, I miss my William.
I really wish there was some way we could help get them back sooner. Supporting the kids has really become a hassle.
We can't work in the factories because we have to maintain the house and help the kids. They're too young to live alone.
Well, now that you mention it, I bought these things called war bonds. Have you heard of them?
No, what are they?
Well, they're these slips of paper that you buy. The money goes to the government and they use it to help feed and armor our troops all over the world.
You mean we can fight the war while being at home cleaning houses?
Yes, by buying war bonds from your local grocery store, you can help the war effort. So buy today and help out our boys.
Due to the need for laborers during World War II, 200,000 black workers moved to the north. There were so many that Detroit was not capable of receiving them. Because they were still treated as second-class citizens, they were not treated fairly from wartime rationing and the overall pressure of the city. There were factories that offered jobs to them, but because the whites were very protective of their borders, of their neighborhoods, the black resident had very little choice but to suffer in horrible living conditions. On June 20th, 1943, fighting broke out between the blacks and the whites of Detroit, Michigan. Over 200 black and white people engaged in a racially motivated fight on Belle Island. The race riot was deeply rooted in racism, poor living conditions, and unequal access to goods and services. Because of the weapons and ammunition in Detroit, the economy boomed, which made the social unrest worse. There were gangs of black and whites who roamed the streets, cars were being set on fire, and people were being beaten to death. There was an ongoing violence for 3 days straight. The mayor and the governor asked for President Roosevelt's help for troops to come and stop the fighting, because the police were not able to sustain the violence. President Roosevelt sent about 6,000 troops to help restore peace. There was almost 700 people who were injured and 34 people who were killed, 25 blacks and 9 white. $2 million were needed to help restore everything that was damaged. This inspired African Americans to protest for their rights later in the 60s during the Civil Rights.
I was born on November 30th, 1874 in Blenheim Palace, Oxford, England. Being an aristocrat was given, being born into our family. My father was a prominent politician, while my mother was an American millionaire. I really didn't have much of a relationship with my parents, so I was raised mostly by nannies. I was a very rebellious young boy. I was sent to boarding school, and this is where I found my passion for English. I married Clementine Heuser, and we were blessed with 5 wonderful children. After I left boarding school, I applied for the Royal Military College and then graduated in December of 1894. I then went to many different countries, where I served in the war by serving as both a soldier and a journalist. My biggest accomplishment would be rallying the British people to fight against the Germans during our darkest hour in World War II. I think that my biggest failure was the Gallipoli campaign. I lost about 44,000 lives, of which 8,000 were Australian. I failed to take Gallipoli Island so that supplies could get to Russia, to the Black Sea during World War I. I lived a wonderful life, but I unfortunately had a stroke, which left me unable to walk and talk properly. I passed away 9 days later.
With the German surrender on May 7, 1945, the war in Europe was over. However, the war still wasn't finished. The Japanese were still in it. The U.S. got closer and closer to the main islands, taking Okinawa Islands 650 miles away. The Japanese believed in a warrior code called Bushido. It taught the Japanese soldiers that it is honorable to die fighting. So as the advancing American soldiers came closer, the Japanese fought harder and harder.
If the Japanese do not surrender, they will face prompt and utter destruction.
Nohoki wakushaki kahushina.
They employed tactics like kamikaze and banzai charges, which are suicide attacks to do as much damage as possible to the invaders. This made President Truman consider other options instead of invasion. Because of the code, Truman dropped leaflets and had a radio broadcast saying that if Japan didn't surrender, prompt and utter destruction would ensue.
Nohoki wakushaki kahushina.
With no surrender on August 6, 1945, a nuclear bomb hit Nagasaki, leaving the city completely destroyed. 3 days later, Hiroshima was hit, and Hirohito surrendered on August 15th. Truman wanted to scare the new communist power of the Soviet Union. Also the Americans' power by using these new deadly bombs. Using these bombs would usher in a new age of warfare and a Cold War along with a tense arms race that would influence the world politics for decades to come.
The Indian Independence Act was granted on July 18, 1947. The leader of this movement was Gandhi, and he gained power in the year 1921. He led many different movements in India and different protests as well. With that being said, obviously the biggest movement he led was the Independence Act for India. After the fighting of World War II, Britain was completely destroyed from the Blitz and in debt from the war. Due to this, pressure from the Indians soon overwhelmed them, and they voted to give India independence and talk to each province about their individual independence. This ended nearly 200 years of British power in these nations. The act received the royal assent on July 18, 1947, and Pakistan came into being on August 14th, and India came into being on August 15th. This was a, quote, last-minute decision mechanism by which the British were able to secure agreement over how independence would take place, end quote. This made many happy as it saw the British sort of step away from the ruler's seat and their own people start to take over. This is a major event in the 40s because it signified the end of colonialism and would also set up for the threat of nuclear attacks between India and Pakistan.
After the First World War, the British took control of Palestine. This promoted Jewish immigration into the Arab land. After World War II, Jewish immigration kick-started because of the Holocaust. They were also shunned in much of Eastern Europe after the war. This led to more and more immigration, creating a large population of Jews in the area. The settling Jews soon became a huge proportion of the population in Palestine. The British turned over control of Palestine to the UN because they couldn't handle it anymore. This promoted the UN to do something. President Truman established a special cabinet to investigate the Palestinian question. President Truman and the cabinet both recommended to the UN that they split Jewish Israel and the Arab Palestine. Israel adopted a constitution, becoming a democracy, and was supported by the U.S. because they were a democratic friend in the Middle East. The split set up many conflicts and tensions in the future, with many wars waged against Israel, and the tensions between U.S. and OPEC over support of Israel would make the creation of Israel a major event in the 40s.
War wound down, the major powers met to reshape the post-war world. The U.S., China, the USSR, and Britain signed a Declaration of the United Nations. This would soon become the basis of the UN. In San Francisco, 50 nations met from China to Argentina.
They wanted to set up an organization that would prevent another world war like Wilson's League of Nations.
Gentlemen, the horrors of the Holocaust have scarred the world. We must never let it happen again. So all the nations of this world must work together and come together to prevent another genocide.
The countries split up to discuss the purpose of the organization, its powers and responsibilities, Security Council, and the International Court of Justice. The 5 biggest countries in the world, China, the USSR, France, Britain, and the US, wanted a veto power that could overturn any decision of the UN. The Big Five argued that they should have the most power because maintaining peace would be mostly up to them. But the small countries feared that one of the Big Five could make the UN powerless. The Big Five got the veto, and the UN Charter was signed, bringing it into existence. The UN was designed to end war and promote peace, justice, and better living for all mankind. The UN would soon become one of the most important events in the 40s, because it would keep peace for many years to come and also change world politics forever as they fight to keep the world safe. It would bring justice and order to all international events, especially clashes between the US and the USSR.
After World War II, Germany was split into 4 occupation zones. The Allied zones made up West Germany, and the Soviets got the East. Also, the capital Berlin was split east and west. However, the Allied part of Berlin was deep in Soviet-occupied Germany. This made the Soviets want all the city since it was in their zone. Allied actions also drove them to want the city. The Allies proposed a plan to make a German state in their occupation zones. They issued a new currency to rebuild their economy, separate it from the USSR, stop the black market in Berlin, and to allow the Marshall Plan to help. This was the final straw for the Soviet, and in June of 1948, the Soviet troops surrounded the city. The Soviet guards are starving now. And stopped all the vital food and supplies from getting into the city. They did this to starve the people and to make the Western powers give them the city. They also cut off the electricity and stopped coal shipments. The people of the West Berlin were left with no power, food, or aid. Unwilling to look weak, Truman had to think of options that wouldn't result in war. He came up with the idea to airdrop supplies into the city. The Soviets did nothing to stop the planes. This would become a major mold for all future interaction between the Allies and the USSR. Both sides would test each other and try to look the toughest while going to the edge of the total nuclear war, which makes this an important event because it sets the stage for the tensions between the US and the USSR.
Man, my tractor broke, but I really need to get this harvest done, so I'm stuck doing it by hand.
Well, if you would have bought the 1948 Ford 8N, you'd still be working.
Really? Are you sure it's that good?
It is that good, and you can't afford it. Here, I'll show you. So, you've got the inline 4-cylinder with a 4-speed manual. It's got a max speed of 13.6 miles an hour.
Wow, that's really good, but my tractor's almost as good.
I'm not sure you get it. This also has power steering and 4-wheel drive. And you can get it for the low cost of $1,404.
Wow, I might just have to pick up one myself.
You might have
The new Ford Model 8N in dealers today. Get yours now at your local Ford dealer. The division between the Democratic West and the Communist East became deeper because of the Soviets blocking U.S. aid to their satellite states, Soviet-backed coup in Czechoslovakia, and the Berlin airlift. This drove most of Western powers to seek mutual defense treaties. Truman went to Congress to ask for permission to seek an international alliance. Once approved, the West started to work out of the North Atlantic Treaty. It took many months of debate to not infringe Congress. Also, to provide for the collective security of the alliance, Europe would need massive military assistance from the U.S. Also, they debated if the alliance should include people outside of the North Atlantic. After it was all figured out, United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe signed the treaty. This organization would change the face of the world because it consolidated a power dedicated to fighting the spread of communism. It would also increase tensions between the USSR and the US in the Cold War. The organization will still fight threats even today.
The Central Intelligence Agency was created to gather, process, and analyze national security information from around the world. The CIA reports to the Director of National Intelligence and is mainly focused on providing information from the President and the Cabinet. People often think the CIA is similar to the FBI, but they're two very different things. The CIA is primarily focused on gathering information overseas, while the FBI concentrates on more at-home security matters. The CIA is the only agency authorized by law to carry out and oversee secret actions at the demand of the President. During World War II, the U.S. created the Office of Strategic Services, which was an organization that gathered information during the war. Because of the successes of the OSS, the United States decided it was best to make an organization not only for war, but for issues that need to be dealt with around the world. This is a major event in the 40s because the CIA would conduct many operations in foreign countries during the Cold War and would play a key part in the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union.
The Americans have built a new atomic weapon. We need one for ourselves.
Ending the war with Japan revealed a new and powerful weapon made by the U.S., nuclear bombs, that could disintegrate entire cities. The U.S. began building these weapons far before the war ended in the Manhattan Project. However, the Soviets had spy rings in the project to pass the information along since the German invasion of the USSR. They were called atomic spies. The information passed from the atomic spies gave the Soviets a jump start on building a bomb for themselves. On August, the Soviets dropped First Lightning in Kazakhstan. They detonated their first nuclear bomb. 1 month later, Truman told the American public that the Soviets have a nuclear bomb, and 1 day later, the Soviets confirmed it. This would become one of the defining moments in the 40s because the U.S. lost their monopoly on the destructive power of the nuclear bomb, and this would start the Cold War as both sides build and face off with a bomb to end all bombs.
Born on December 18th, 1878, in the town of Gori, Georgia. My mother's name was Kiki and my father's name was Barasun, even though I believe, and many others believe, that he's not my real father and I'm actually the son of a priest, because I'm too good to be the son of his. I attended a local school in a hometown. I was recommended to be sent to the Tiflis Seminary in 1893 and eventually went. When I was young, I was part of a very poor family and became fascinated with poetry as soon as I was able to read. I wanted to make a career out of it, but it wasn't good enough for people. To this day, I still write my own poetry, and one of my favorite lines from my poems is that a man is struck down to the ground and still strives again to reach the pure mountain. I'm also a fan of the films and a huge, huge fan of the ballet.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used in a court of law against you. State your name for the record.
Joseph Stalin.
Were you involved in the Tiflis bank robbery of 1907?
Yes. This sort of sparked my political career. I was on the governing political bureau during the Russian Civil War and helped form the Soviet Union in 1922. After the passing of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, I rose in power and later became the leader of the Soviet Union. My government believed in an anti-fascist movement throughout Europe in the 1930s, particularly during the Spanish Civil War. I was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize twice. I also made the Soviet Union a military superpower. I died March 5th, 1953. My bad.
This is not the first time I've been whipped in this.
We chose the 40s. We got no.
Of the major world event!
Come on.
Yeah, your camera's gonna die.
Look up really quick. Here, hey Siri. Hey Siri. Hey Siri! I attended a school in my local hometown and was